challenging corporate practices. Not the things like the 8-hour work week, like lobbying to ensure workplace security, like ensuring there is a minimum wage, have happened far before the age of political consumerism. If opposition side wants to claim that there is a critical mass of individuals who are ready to lobby governments for reform to corporations, to have investigative journalism, which is then going to be followed up by individuals and protested on a moral level, this is on our side of the motion as well, insofar as it's not clearly political consumerism. What we're going to claim is that political consumerism is the least efficient and least important of all of these ways. Why? One, first of all, because most people do not have the information about the full origin of a product. Not a lot of things we use, for example, in healthcare or our day-to-day routines, also use derivatives of oil. You are unaware that this happens insofar as you do not know what ingredients are in the product you're using. You have no idea whether it's from ExxonMobil or Royal Dutch Shell, which means that there is no information in terms of the intermediary where exactly the goods are coming from. Secondly, you know that most people tend to prioritize convenience over morality, either because it's simply more pragmatic to them and they rationalize their behavior to themselves, insofar as they say, look, it's a collective action problem. I may stop buying from this company, but nobody else will. This is why we're aware that the phones that we use crystals mined in the Congo by people working under slavery. We still don't throw our phones away, or simply because they necessarily have to, because they don't have the economic capital to afford themselves to buy different things. They have to buy the cheapest. This means that there is never a critical mass which is sufficient to make companies change their policies in a large way. So what this leads to is essentially companies making cosmetic changes to sate the hunger of those who are the most radical, but essentially what happens at the end is whitewashing. This is things like Dove and Gillette having commercials on disenfranchised groups, but selling whitening cream, but this is crowded out by the noise of saying, we got Dove to change their policies. This is airline companies providing carbon offsetting, which is only going to be efficient 100 years, but still having deals with oil companies. We again crowd out the discussion because the noise is about getting some change from the corporations. This portrayed as a huge win, which essentially doesn't change anything, but it also allows corporations to portray themselves as victims. It allows them to talk about their freedom of speech, which was denied to them, and to talk about how all kinds of political opinions are legitimate, to go to the Supreme Court and actually get legal precedents which support their right to do that, like for example in the Citizens United case, which enforces their position, to talk about all of the jobs that were lost on a local level from disprivileged people who had to be fired because we lost profits, which allows companies to take a position of moral superiority. It is the burden on opposition to show whether there is any kind of efficient change on their side, rather than on the comparative, having corporations utilizing and weaponizing this for their own interests. This is why opposition a priori doesn't exist. I'm going to run a couple of arguments as to why open government exists, but before that, I will take closing opposition.
Doesn't green and whitewashing occur on your side too, just not with none of the political consumerist accountability that exists on ours?
The whitewashing is easier when corporations can portray themselves as having responded to popular demand. I have shown you that the popular demand on your side of the house is specifically strong enough to be loud, but too weak to actually create meaningful change, which means that corporations don't have to respond to meaningful demands, but can still weaponize this. There are two scenarios. In the case where there is a significant mass of people willing to protest corporations, this happens outside of political consumerism. The other scenario is where there isn't, and this is where we do not have accountability. We win on both. Here are the arguments from opening government. One, note, corporations are not monoliths. We usually perceive Chick-Fil-A as, oh my God, they are this one entity that has a political opinion. But corporations are aggregates of individuals. They are your average janitor, your waiter, your cook, and your cleaner, who have absolutely no recourse towards company policy, but very often no other recourse to their existence, insofar as this is the only job that they have. And there's always structural unemployment, which means that there are other individuals who are willing to take the job for even worse conditions than you if you're not willing to accept it, which means that they are coerced into tacit consent for a certain policy that they may not support themselves. This therefore means that by engaging in political consumerism, you are least likely to harm those at the top. Note these are people who have contingency funds, engage in million-dollar lawsuits, and still stay afloat. They have investments in stock markets and stuff like this. You're most likely to harm the individuals who are at the bottom of the corporate ladder. They are the ones who are going to get fired. They are the ones whose benefits are going to be cut. They're the ones who will not get potential jobs in the future because the company will not expand, or the company will use this as an excuse. It will knowingly sacrifice the workers to paint itself as a victim. We say this is illegitimate because one, you harm the most vulnerable, but secondly, it's a morally undue punishment, insofar as a lot of these individuals did not have recourse into whether or not they support a company, but secondly, you do not have epistemic access to all of the individual preferences of people within the company, which means that insofar as you implement a blanket punishment on all of them, and they are in different moral positions, the act is immoral a priori. This is also problematic because another reason why companies are not likely to change is because, look, one, if they have strong opinions, like Chick-Fil-A has portrayed itself as going very regressive and conservative, they want to keep their loyal consumer base. And they are aware that their consumer base is going to support the company, is going to buy more. So they have another contingency here, right? What they're going to sacrifice is the people at the bottom of the chain, which this is illegitimate. But secondly, we want to talk about recourse. Note that corporations have significant influence over governments in terms of being able to lobby governments for regulations, in terms of elections very often being decided on corporate donations. This means that insofar as you have to control the government to have legitimate recourse over your life, insofar as the government controls your life through policy and through its means of violence, but also insofar as you can never escape being under the yoke of a government, it follows from this that you need to have some sort of influence over corporations. What the opposition side then does is exclusivize this influence to the rich, because note that a huge amount of individuals do not have the resources to be political consumers, because they do not have the ability to choose to buy something which is environmentally friendly and therefore has a larger price, but because of geographical proximity, because of something being cheap, because of budgetary restraints, they have to buy lower and smaller, which means that the only political opinions represented within the system are the political opinions of the rich, who, by changing the politics of corporations, essentially by proxy also control the state. Note that these are individuals who already have disproportionate power within the state, insofar as they have a larger amount of capital, which means they've accrued social connections and education, which raise them to the top of the ladder, which means they also have powerful positions where they influence other people's lives, but very often these are also people who can accrue capital and pump it into the political system, into political campaigns, which means this is essentially only another system of systematically excluding the poor individuals who are more in need of state aid from fundamental control over the lives in which they live, insofar as corporations have influence over the state, and these people cannot influence the corporations. But lastly, note what political consumerism does. It entrenches the belief that corporations are political actors, that they should actively participate in political discourse, and therefore that their speech is legitimate political speech. This entrenches over time subconscious heuristics, such as the belief that money is speech, such as the belief that corporations are no different than individuals, which entrenches the belief and creates less precedents for us to stop corporations from fundamentally deciding elections and deciding social issues, from literally pumping money into the system. Given that these heuristics are created in the long time, we say that this is also a bad idea. These are the reasons why opening government wins.
The Prime Minister, for the verifying speech, invite the leader of the opposition to open the case for opposition. Take care.
Hi, am I audible? Cool. Okay. Well, sorry, I heard a noise in the back of my room, and it's 3 in the morning, so I hope you can understand why I was scared. Okay. Yeah, I guess shout out to everyone that's watching on Facebook. Why are you watching this? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The truest power in society is the ability to determine what is and what isn't up for debate. Somehow, what the government chooses to do, what corporations choose to do, are up for debate, but not what you yourself choose to consume and eat. We believe individuals have a fundamental epistemic right to know what they are eating, to know what they are consuming, and have the right to make decisions based on that information. Before I move into material, responses. First response. They make the claim that the group of people that are doing this action are strong enough to be loud, but too weak to make meaningful change. First response, they are strong enough. Examples such as Brunei being forced to backtrack on their anti-gay policies, as large corporations such as JP Morgan threatened to pull out, as well as other corporations such as Bath and Body Shop being forced to change to become cruelty-free cosmetics and join the other alliance of other cruelty-free cosmetics because of the sheer amounts of people being unwilling to consume these corporations' products for the reason that they were cruel to animals. There are 3 structural underpinning reasons for why it is the case that they are strong enough. The first is, it is because of political consumerism that there is a larger push for information. Secondly, perhaps in general or in the abstract, most people prefer convenience over morality, but the feeling viscerally of directly contributing to someone else's suffering, whether it be through the sweatshops where these shoes came from, or the actual people that you harm by the resource extraction involved in this means that you yourself are, as an individual, are far more likely to feel connected to this. But the third and last reason as for why is, even if a relatively small amount of people consume this thing, the people most likely to engage themselves in political consumerism are the middle class, or the people with the political and economic capital to actually make somewhat of a difference, both in the corporations' profit margins, as well as the ballot box itself. So this first response proves that they are strong enough to make meaningful change. But even if they're not strong enough to make meaningful change, the fact that they're loud is itself a good thing, which I'll argue in my first argument. The second response is them saying corporations are not monoliths, which isn't actually a real meaningful point, because even if it might be bad that an individual loses out on food, it is morally arbitrary whether or not it is this person in this corporation or some other worker in some other corporation that is not getting access to this money, since the money itself being shifted around is fungible. First, I want to point out that they do not have a right to this money/income. So insofar as it's a legitimate dimension of consumption to make decisions based upon, it is not a morally egregious harm that this individual loses out on access to its money. But secondly, compared to people in other companies that are themselves also potentially indifferent to the crime a corporation is doing, we would prefer this money go to people that are also indifferent but are less complicit in the crimes being committed by a corporation. Thirdly and lastly, the belief that money is speech as a point, which I think is a fair point. The first problem I have with this is just it's not entirely clear why this would go away. If it is the case that the rich are in charge on both sides, they will have as much incentive as possible to make decisions based on to change societal narratives about the value of money itself. It's not like actual rules would change. But lastly, as a point, I'd also like to make the claim that even if it is the case money is speech, the cosmetic changes that they themselves concede to are less likely for this to be the case, because the overt social narrative is that money is change, but that's a good thing because the fact that this is in the corporate dimension means that we're actually making some form of change. Okay, first argument, political consumerism is good because even though we don't have any epistemic access to the choices that people make, this gives people more information to make decisions. The first and most basic benefit is that the average individual knows now a lot more about corporations for three reasons. The first is that they're now more careful about the stance of the politics of the corporation they are consuming from. Secondly, they are forced to consider the ethics and consequences of that consumption. But thirdly, they now maintain an interest in the future action of the company that they're continuing to consume from. Generally, this manifests in being more willing to research into the actions that corporations are doing. Generally, this means that people are more willing to look for this information, but also the pre-existing demand means that media corporations, as well as investigative journalism sources, are more likely to cater to this demand and feel less risky about making decisions based around this demand. Moreover, again, for the reason that open government identifies, corporations are forced to reveal their politics more and pay lip service to the politics of the people. Why is this broadly a good thing? First outcome, as an action, this is in and of itself a good thing because you as an individual now have more information related to your choice. This means that you as an individual, one, feel like you can make a larger change in society. And the reason why this is important is because your beliefs are only important insofar as they have meaningful consequences. Perhaps Gov side might not get like some kind of strong change. It's not entirely clear why this is a good thing, given that the change is likely to be symmetric on both sides, as people on both ends of the political spectrum will be engaging in political consumerism anyway. The important thing, however, is that you are then not involved in choices that you might indirectly regret or choices that will indirectly harm you in the future. Someone, for example, that might be ardently against the war in Yemen might be horrified to learn that the corporation that they bought from indirectly supports this war or supports it through the political candidate that they might be, hanging their hat on. So additionally, as an individual, you feel better about this. But secondly, you're also more likely to make an average individual engaged in conventional politics. The reason why this is important is because political apathy is quite a huge problem. So at risk of rehashing the survey, right, a lot of people feel broadly apathetic towards politics for a lot of reasons. They feel like they can't make any change. They feel like both sides are equally bad, and they feel like they don't know enough about politics to make an informed decision. How does our side resolve this? Firstly, people are now on our side more capable of analyzing politics through the lens of consumption. Individuals are happier because of the fact that they have more ways to look at this political world. Secondly, people are given more ways to feel activated in politics outside the ballot box, because as an action, this is just far more accessible than the alternatives, where going out to rallies is scary, potentially might get you shot, and physically dangerous and exhausting, where the ballot box is a rare opportunity and one that barely feels like you're making any difference, and sharing slacktivism at face level is just simply quite unintuitive, both in terms of how much impact you make, but as well as the importance of it in society. Thirdly and lastly, people are also given the opportunity to participate and feel to be part of a greater political movement, which means that they're more likely to be engaged in the long term because they feel like they're participating in something great. This means that individuals are more politically engaged, as well as get all the benefits that opening government does not want us to have. I'll take a PY from CG now.
Do you think a Republican administration will hold Chick-Fil-A to account for food and hygiene standards as long as Chick-Fil-A keeps virtue signaling right-wing points?
No, but I imagine that the Democratic administration would.
But also, I imagine that even if we don't hold them accountable, there are two things here. The first is that even if they're not held directly accountable by the justice system, I don't imagine that on either side, the Republican administration will hold them accountable. I think the net change then comes from, are we able to marginally hold them accountable by forcing them to retract their policies, by making this a constant cost on them until they're willing to change their action? Note this is also an additional reason as for why they're not strong, but they are allowed change isn't really true. But the last reason as for why this is a good thing is because as an individual, just political information is considerably more accessible to you. The fact that corporations are paying lip service to this at all is actually quite a good thing. The first is because it makes people aware of the actual bad things a corporation did before. So like the fact that people are aware that corporations in general did bad things is a good thing. But the second thing is that it also means people are more politically activated for the reason that they feel like they can make a broader change. So at the end of this speech, we do two things. The first is we engage with the epistemic access point. So this means that CO can't run any arguments saying that, oh, corporations will go further to the left because we don't really care about that thing. The second thing we do is we explain why people feel better about the politics that they participate in and why they feel more engaged in the society that they live in. It is for this reason then that you must oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for the clarifying speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government. Here.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Figure this out. Okay, I will start like now. Mitigating, rebutting OO, and then extension from our case. First of all, most firms outside of, I don't know, fucking Chick-Fil-A and these sort of things deal with businesses more than end consumers. And on our side of the house, this is already enough to like mitigate and rebut a large part of their case, which doesn't deal with this. There are more intermediary companies than there are end-to-end companies. And if they want to show trickle down to this level, then I think they need to do a lot of work in able to show this. Secondly, on the idea of more information to give decisions, I do not agree with this on a couple of levels. First of all, they say, look, this is going to give like more information to people and to do decision. I think first of all, it's a loud minority of people who do this. It's not the general public. It's not like a public outcry. Just because maybe it seems loud, it doesn't mean that the general population or the average folk thinks that they should be boycotted. Secondly, I think that investigative journalists focus more on what companies support in politics in this sort of scenario than how they treat workers or their business practices or how they should reform the system as a whole. Maybe if the system is problematic on their side house because it's more popular and you're going to get more likes and like more taps on the back as an investigative journalist. We're not sure why this is a good trade-off. But thirdly, you individually think you can change society, while on the other hand, people laugh at you and buy the thing even more to counter. And honestly, I think this is this opposite effect of people not liking you boycotting and then just like buying more from the company. Sometimes, even if it's not the case that it screws workers, is something which is counteractive. So people are just going to buy and go to Chick-Fil-A and say, yeah, Chick-Fil-A is a good guy because liberals boycott this. And this eventually leads to you having very little impact, even if it's not the case that this screws the company and screws the workers, and like doing the very actually opposite, because there's always going to be more people who are going to be like, if they like Chick-Fil-A and they also want to do this politically, more than if they don't like Chick-Fil-A and they are not going to do this like politically. But I think that companies get so much publicity that this is crazy. Even if they don't get extra customers inherently because people are going to counter boycott, they repeatedly make more money because they lose some money on negative PR, but they have a ton of free PR. You're in all sorts of different medias. People recognize that you exist. Maybe they're like inherently like this. What is advertising? They're inherently going to have your position, your name in the mind, and they're going to choose you maybe in a later stage over some other companies. So this essentially benefits the company, I think, in the worst case for the opposition. Okay. So I want to talk about the movement itself. What is the psychology of this movement itself? This is basically, guys, GameStop. This is power in numbers. This is the mentality of the herd. If we get enough people to do stuff, we will change things. We are going to change them, break the system. Big bad Wall Street. We are going to do something to you. So what is the comparative to other things, which are also prone to these things, but not to the same extent? And this is what the debate is essentially about. First, this is a constant financial pressure requirement. you constantly need to buy worse products or like products that are more expensive in order to support the cause. This is not true as with maybe making a publicity campaign on how they make workers bad or anything like that. No, please chat. Secondly, this is constant elitism messaging requirement. You constantly need to tell to people that they can afford to buy more expensive products because they need to be political and support your cause. Unlike the other things where you can say to people, look, if you can chip in something, maybe chip in, this is a good cause, you know, come aboard on our side of the thing. You cannot do that, or it's compared to reverse on their side of the house. Thirdly, this is enabling the company to constantly compare this to firing workers or to losing to the competition because they say, oh, we are losing money because they are boycotting us. Look at how bad we are. This is the victim position, which inherently harms your cause. Fourthly, this is inherently an extortion. This is an extortion. Change something or we're not going to buy from you. So from companies, the negative reaction is definitely to not negotiate with terrorists in this type of organization, because later on they're going to do the same thing, and you're constantly going to want to think about this. You are in no position to actually, you know, think forward or to relocate products and blah blah blah. This is something which companies react very negatively to. In the life. But fifthly, boycotting as per se is something which ties income redistribution to be politicized extremely, because you're saying you should spend more, and this is okay because there's a political cause. This creates and normalizes fighting on the same ground, but in other way by corporations, which are also going to ask for some sort of redistribution based on this norm becoming a politics. They're going to ask for rights for them, blah, blah, blah. The political thing the team talks about never is really engaged. But also, this is inherently a social media run phenomena, and one which is highly, highly dependent on the sharing momentum. Shell made oil that was used in this super product and then used in this cream, and then you need to know about this. The umbrella organization did this and they produced this specific juice or food, Coca-Cola, blah, blah, blah. The amount of information people are required to meaningfully boycott in numbers is sufficient to crowd out these things, and is so huge that it's crowding out the ability we can give to change. You cannot recognize that there are 17 products which do this at the same time, and the amount of information momentum you need to have on social media and change, and the amount of effort you need to actually get this to the average consumer, as opposed to some of the other ways where you don't need to make these like bad connections, where you can just say, okay, look, the company is bad, Johnson & Johnson is bad. It's not that you should not buy their product, it's that they are bad, and you don't have to tie this and explain to people that when they buy Head and Shoulders, it's actually Johnson & Johnson and not Head and Shoulders as it says on the package, blah, blah, blah. When you go on BP, or when you go on your random like gas station, it's not the BP, it's actually Exxon that you're putting in your tank, and blah, blah, blah. It's so much more that you will get crowded, and there's so much hours and money and things wasted on this, and like activist hours, that this is like something which is very not efficient. I want to take a CEO, and then I'm going to talk about why this is bad for politics.
You mentioned that a lot of these alternatives are inaccessible because the prices are higher. Why are the prices higher?
What do you mean? Like we have established that people who are rational probably want to make the ratio of best product and lowest price. So what you are putting in this calculus is, do not buy the best product, do not buy the product which you are used to, do not buy the cheapest product, but buy the product that is politically correct. Maybe for some people, you're going to awaken them and say, there's a cheaper product that is not as bad, but this is a minority of people. Let's be honest in this debate. Okay, so let's talk about politics. I already talked about how this is elitization of politics, preferring activists, woke folks over regular folks. Paying more for politics is what people fucking despise in the status quo. Like, they probs don't like politics already, and now you're asking them to not buy products they like for a random cause that they should be able to support. But not only this, but this also causes huge amounts of polarization that is essentially tied to corporate interest in politics. This is a recipe for political chaos and politicization of everything, and politics for not knowing their boundaries. People have a right to not be political and hate politics, and they have a right to make their consumer choices based on liking the product, not liking the product, and that's it. That's the freedom from politics and all of these movements and people who are trying to sway my opinion. I don't care about this. I live my life. I want my good shampoo. I want my good food. I want my good car, and I don't care what they do unless they kill the guy. Right? So this is going on their side of the house when this is so much in the media, because they need to have this mechanism for their to work, that you are not free from this, and this is an attack on people's right to be free from politics. Very proud to propose.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the verifying speech. Invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close the first half of this debate. Yeah.
Hello, testing your microphone. Can I be heard properly? All right, sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Luigi. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. So I'm going to watch the chat for all of your POIs. All right. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. So 2 points of extension material in the speech. Number 1, why the political consumerism is likely to be targetive. And secondly, why virtue signaling is better than the counterfactual. Before this, 2 points of extraneous rebuttal against the previous speaker. The first point that I want to rebut very clearly right now is the claim is that there is a small number of minorities, a vocal minority that is doing this policy, and often they are going to be forced or coerced to buy more expensive products, which is harmful for themselves, and then eventually it becomes a waste for the movement, and then a lot of more people are made to buy in, and that's also going to be harmful for themselves and also eventually for the corporation. So I just want to deconstruct this in terms of 5 responses. The first is that it doesn't really have to be more expensive if they go to another product. I mean, the examples on the info side are clearly not the expensive products that they need to do. So if you go Chick-Fil-A and then you go somewhere else, I don't know, you can go McDonald's or Jollibee or another type of store. But the second example on Ben&Jerry's, I think there are other ice creams that people can buy, and that's also fine with them, and that's also okay. But so the price is not a big problem, and I think I mitigate that to a significant extent. But the second response is that obviously you get more and more people, even if you are a vocal minority, you want more and more people to participate in your boycott too. And that's part of their argument on virtue signaling, which they also say, because if it is significant that it makes companies virtue signal, then definitely more people are buying in and the demand is also changing. So there is a significant change that also forces some corporations to make some competition on it or compete on the level of advertisements or political awareness for individuals. So it's not a vocal minority, it expands to more people. So David's argument on political awareness and political motivation still applies, and therefore our principle still stands that it allows more people to gain more information, and the marginal change for people to be able to uncover more scandals or more political controversies in many corporations still stands, even if there is a potentiality for them to try and hide and cover up many of these instances, because it already happens now. We have more leverage to do so with political consumerism. The third response I want to make is, so again, right, so they have this tension. In this part of their speech, they're saying that, oh, it's harmful because they're made to buy more expensive products. But they also say in the PM speech that a lot of these individuals are rich people who have the capacity to do these boycotts in the first place. So if that is the case, let's be reasonable here. These are individuals who have the capacity to still make these boycotts, and sometimes they might even be leveraged by a lot of high-profile individuals at the same time, which may include other celebrities that are also politically motivated to do this or encourage more people to participate. If that is the instance, then there is a non-existent harm at opening government. The benefits still trickle down to the rest of the movement or the rest of the people that still have that political opinion or who otherwise had no capacity to be able to do this boycott no matter what. But the other response I want to make is that this still doesn't respond to the heart of the principle of David's speech. We said, even if it doesn't make any change at all to a company, even if there's nothing that changes at all, even the virtue signal as much as they can do, no matter what, it is your ability to vote and show and indicate your preference and tell other individuals about it that is in and of itself a good thing, because we allow people to vote for libertarians, we allow people to vote for whatever they want, whatever their political opinions are, even if it doesn't change the outcome of the election. But because of the fact that they're able to participate and otherwise they would have been apathetic, that is a good thing no matter what. But the last response I want to make then is this. So just to be very clear, the comparative of Gov is that they say there's other forms of activism that are good. So what types of activism they may lead to may actually even be more harmful and more broad spanning. For example, if they want to create broader regulations that lobby in Congress or lobby in Senate, that actually might endanger many of the products or the industries that they are talking about, but not the particular individuals or companies that they also want to target. So if that's a harm that they talked about in terms of accountability, it harms the lowest denomination of the company, then that's a harm that also exists in their model, because people who are ingrained, who really love these products, like sometimes people boycott these products because they believe that there's genuine change for the company as possible. They just want one higher CEO to just resign and then they can buy in again. But that restoration and trust and relationship is only possible with political consumerism, not with otherwise. I'll take the POI from CG.
When Adidas tells American people Black Lives Matter, don't American people forget that Adidas makes the sneakers at the behest of 10-year-old Bangladeshi kids?
Yeah, so so on the virtue signaling point, I would just simply say that number one, there's a lot more awareness on this issue with political consumerism. We only uncover these issues more and more with the existence of virtue signaling and the capacity for us to have more media scrutiny on these policies. The comparative otherwise is that they would still have a profit incentive to do that same abuses, but probably it's going to be done in a consistent, sustained manner. And at some point, they're never going to want to change no matter what. So firstly, why political consumerism is likely to be targeted. So there are three reasons so I believe it's going to be targeted. So I just to respond completely to opening government's argument on that it sometimes harms some individuals. We want to target the people who are accountable, who should be accountable. Number one, if we are talking about public stances or public scandals that a CEO has engaged in or a scandal for a leaked racist memo, then obviously other coworkers or other executives will be willing to throw them off the bus or throw them off the ship because they have an incentive to replace that CEO otherwise, and therefore there's a reform in that company. Number two, if we are talking about operational decisions such as like a sourcing decision or a development of a certain AI technology that is somehow unethical, then by command responsibility we can also pinpoint that with more information with political consumerism, because you can point to the demand and the choices and the traces for how this decision was made, and therefore you show which individual should bear the brunt of this responsibility and the damage. And a good example of this would be like, for example, the head of the AI ethics committee in Google, for example, that was accused of creating some decisions that were very racist, in particular in these instances. So being allowed to make these policies is also led to those individuals having been forced to resign. But lastly, if we're talking about the hidden structural political problems and conspiracies with these corporations, such as they're suddenly committing tax fraud or funding a campaign in Trump in some ways, then obviously whistleblowers also have incentives for their own reasons to be able to uncover those traces of information and try and bring that to the media and the public. But this only happens with an impetus of political consumerism. It only happens with our ability to gain more and more traction for more individuals. So just to complete the last response, this is the second extension on virtue signaling to respond to the closing gov POI. So number one, we believe that virtue signaling is better because it allows competition for more individuals to participate in virtue signaling. So even if many companies are doing it at the same time, some will still be better than others. We can rank on which companies are better. But number two, at some point, having so many ad campaigns is not so cost effective, and sometimes they can just make a reform that can be better for the company in the future. For all these reasons and more, because we believe that our political consumerism is principally just and there are actual tangible benefits because of this, I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for the verifying speech. Invite the Member of Government to open the second half of this debate.
Hey, can you hear me? In closing government, we're going to take head on the opening opposition case about political engagement and accountability and argue how it gets worse on three levels. First of all, in terms of worsening discourse overall and the nature of political discourse and why that crowds out the better things, such that we prefer that on a trade-off. Second of all, how it leads to more imbalances in the political system, which create inequities and therefore don't get the just outcomes that everyone wants in this debate. And then thirdly, why even if opening opposition are right, why it necessarily makes social and political movements much worse, such that even if they exist as separate entities, making them intertwined with corporate networks, why they're forced to do that and why intertwining them with corporate networks makes them less effective at what they want to do. First of all, I think a piece of framing that's quite important. So opening opposition say that people become more aware of the politics of the company, which means they can hold them accountable, etc. I just think, okay, this argument is quite cyclical, right? Because the only reason companies take political stances in the first place and get involved in activism is because something they have to do to compete to get consumers, because it's now one of the criteria on which they're judged in their success in the market rather than just the quality of their products. So they're incentivized to get in, and they have to be able to get in on political commentary because that's how they're competing for people. I think opening government, we're fair to say this isn't about corporate social responsibility in the sense of internal company practices, because that's separate to political consumerism. Even if it is about holding companies accountable for specific practices that they do, I think the answer to this has to be apolitical government regulation, regulation which is able to call out bad practices and able to harm it. The thing is, and Hamza POIs this, and I want to develop it, is that governments are much less able to hold companies to account at the point where companies become political, because there's incentives for governments to pander to companies if they're doing something which helps their agenda. And on the comparative, on the flip side, if governments do something which is against the company, the company's politics, and the company's always able to say, well, you know, I'm a martyr, like that action was politically motivated, the government are only taking away my lessons for this or clamping down my ability to do this because we said this thing on abortion or we said this thing on immigration. And that undermines the capacity of the government to be able to put in regulation which holds companies to account in terms of making decisions which objectively help people. I think this is a more persuasive way to be able to get change within companies and make them responsible than opening government talking about investigative journalism, because it's governments who have the capacity to be able to get the information from companies and to be able to enforce regulations on companies in the first place. And if you make them less able to engage in that because the debate becomes too political such that they can't enforce regulation in the best way, that's incredibly dangerous for everyone, given there's no other accountability mechanisms on how companies actually behave, and that's incredibly limited. So that's why it's more important to prioritize the government control rather than people purchasing when all they can do is influence messages but not actually influence company practices if it's harder to get that exposed. But then I think the big clash in this debate becomes about political engagement and accountability and if that's good or bad. The first thing I want to say is that on the trade-off, I think that the way that which political discourse evolves, even if more people become involved just superficially, it gets much worse because it becomes much more simplistic, because the incentive of companies is always to get you into a particular political view or particular social movement so that you'll buy their product, and then it ends there. So they never have incentives to do the kind of nuance or self-reflection which social movements, which are the realistic comparative of how people get involved in politics, always have incentives to do, because their incentive structure is about advancing their cause. And to do that, you have to be critical, you have to self-reflect, you have to improve, you have to have these kind of discussions which go beyond just a superficial papering over or something, which is why when you make companies the dominant voice, they're able to simplify and make the discourse much more trivial, which means you don't get tangible concrete outcomes, and there's no incentives for them to, for example, hold governments to account and make life harder for themselves, because all they want to do is make you feel like you're participating and give you avenues to participate, like buy this product and you're a good person because you've been complicit in our movement, and not actually go beyond that. So it makes the whole thing much more superficial, and people feel like they've achieved a good goal because they supported a good company, so they don't take the next step of actually making it inform their political vote or going and joining a social movement and protesting. And these are how actual change comes about, because companies have incentives to make you feel like you're achieving something even if you're not. I think that's why it gets more simplistic. The second thing, even if it doesn't get more simplistic, it creates massive imbalances with which kind of political sides win. And opening governments start to say this when they say, well, people who have more money therefore win, and you make it imbalanced in that way. But I think they miss the bigger point that progressivism is just much more likely to be disunited than right-wing politics for lots of reasons, because a cornerstone of leftism is critiquing power structures. So as soon as you get into any power structure, in a corporate network or a successful social movement, you then become something which has to internalize and self-critique, which isn't a weakness that right-wing movements and organizations have to hold themselves accountable to, because it's not part of the ideology. I think this is why, for example, in left-wing political movements or social movements, there's often an intersectional race to the bottom, as in, yeah, you support Black Lives Matter, but you're a white man, so have you checked your privilege in these ways? And you undercut people who are supporting your cause in that way. I think this is manifesting an ideological purity contest. So yes, it's great that you supported this cause, but you haven't said anything about X cause, so that's terrible. And that's something which is much more intrinsic to left-wing politics, which means you're less likely to have a united consumer base around certain companies than right-wing politics is, or it's quite simplistic here, but in terms of anti-progressive politics, because they're much more united around the idea of free speech. You can say what you want, so you don't have to be as internally critical, which literally just means you fragment the market. It's the same as splitting votes. You fragment the market on the more progressive side, which means those companies aren't able to compete at the higher level or become much more dominant, which means you're doing it on an unequal platform. I think this is harmful, because then even if you want to be able to create mechanisms for accountability and for political engagement, it's ineffective if one side is structurally less advantaged to compete in this kind of commercial setting than the other one. Even if that's not true, even if both sides can compete, and this is a good gateway to get people involved in social movements, why does it make social movements so much worse? Firstly, because social movements have to be involved in the commercial landscape, because this is now a critical way that you get supporters. So they'll literally be left behind if they don't, which means there's no genuine choice about whether or not you don't get involved in corporate networking, because you have to, because all the other ones are doing it, and otherwise you're going to fall behind and become irrelevant. Even if you start off with good intentions, as in working with companies to be able to work towards your cause and promote your cause, working within that structure means that you have to pander to that structure, and you're likely to get desensitized to the things they do, which makes you much more likely to change your political views or become corrupted in that way.
Don't you think it's much harder to get people to criticize and reform a product from a social movement if it is the case that they're already actively using and engaging with that product?
But I think the comparative is people engaging in social movements and pushing for politics outside the constraints of what specific companies do with relation to specific products. I think this debate is about what they support in general, as opposed to like specific practices in that company. I think social movements gets worse because when you the way to succeed is by hiring people that are going to succeed in corporate networks to get you sponsorship, to get you companies that are going to show allyship with you. The way that you select people becomes not about who best represents the integral ideology of that company, which is likely to be a more diverse workforce, or not workforce, but diverse membership. It's likely to be the people who are going to be able to get you those corporate partnerships which are necessary for success, which means that's a mechanism by which social movements become less diverse and representative and true to their own goals in itself. I think finally a mechanism which is so important is that the poor get massively alienated from social movements. Opening government say some people can't afford to participate in political consumerism. That's fine, but the impact of that is that they then get branded as not being like morally pure enough because they weren't able to partake in the thing which is liberating social movements. Because social movements, you know, if you have to purchase responsibly to be a good citizen, then poor people are unable to participate in that, so feel alienated from social movements, which means that they all get less diverse. So even if more people superficially engage in social movements, the actual structures within them and decision-making processes get much less diverse, much less representative, much less ideologically pure, which ultimately leads to worse outcomes and less impactful outcomes. Thank you.
I thank the member of government for the verifying speech. Invite the member of opposition to continue the debate for opposition. Here.
I'll just grab those.
Yeah.